Obviously, it would be pretty boring if all we could do with our Angular application is somehow magically connect our JavaScript to some piece of HTML page and really do nothing else with it. So really, we need some sort of a mechanism for the view, which is our index.html, and for app.js, which has or contains our view model, to be able to share data. Right now, I'm located in the folder called lecture05, which is located in the fullstack-course 5/examples folder. And I've already set up my browser sync, so it's displaying the page that we're looking at, which is this index.html. In fact, let's give it a little bit of a better title than that. Let's give it an H1, and we'll tell it my first Angular JS app, so we could see something actually in the page. Okay, so let's go ahead and close the file browser inside Atom. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use a special object that AngularJS provides for us in order to share data between our view model and our view. And that special object is called $scope. Whenever, by the way, you see inside AngularJS $, in front of some variable name, it means that this is something that is reserved for Angular. This is something that Angular provides. There's nothing really stopping you from naming your own variables with a $, but the convention is for you not to do that because Angular is reserving kind of the $, for anything that it provides out of the box. So this scope variable right here, and we'll discuss later how the scope variable or how the scope object even gets here, can have properties defined on it that are going to be exposed to the view. So if I say scope.name and say Yaakov, this .name is actually now sitting on the scope, and this scope is available inside my ng controller or anything below it or inside of it that this ng controller is in charge of. So I could place an expression here, which is double curly braces or mustache or however you want to call these characters, and I could say name. If I place name over here, since name is sitting on the scope, and the scope is defined right here with a name, the Angular framework will assume that this is something that it should look for on the scope. So if I say that, you'll see that all of a sudden Yaakov here shows up in my page because it looked on the scope, which is bound to this particular view model, which is bound to this particular controller, and it's being displayed, therefore, right here between these two divs. Now, the value of name is not the only thing that we can reference here. We can reference whatever we want on the scope and then expose that to our index.html. So for example, I could go ahead and create a function, let's say called sayHello, and there's going to be a function that returns hello Coursera. So now I could go back to my index.html, and instead of name, I could call that function. Since again, scope is something that's assumed, I could just say hello, not to forget the parens, because this is a function, not just a value. And when I save that, and now we see it says hello Coursera. Now, a more interesting case is for me to show you that I could declaratively bind a piece of HTML to my scope. So let's go ahead and erase that and put an input field here. And in this case, it will be just a text box. And I'll use a special attribute, Angular attribute called ngModel, to tell it that I want the value of this input attribute to always be equal to something on my scope, something called name. So it will now assume that there's something on my scope called name, and if we go back and look, there's in fact something on my scope called name, and it's equal Yaakov. And if we go back to our index.html, we'll see that now we're binding that value to whatever the input value here is. And you see here in our HTML or in our web page, the Yaakov showed up as the value of this input box. Now, in fact, if we keep changing that, this is something that is changing actually the value that is attached to the name property on our scope. One quick way to determine that it's actually true is to not only bind this name value or this name property to this input element, but also output it right next to it. Let's say inside my input is, and then we could just go ahead and output name. So if we save it, You could say, since we refreshed it, it said inside my input is Yaakov. But as we change this, take a look as to what's going on with this variable. As we're going to change that, since this variable is completely bound to our scope's name property, the second we change it, which is what this is doing, it's looking for any changes on the name property of our scope, it's going to automatically change this name as well. So I could say Coursera, and you could see as I type, the other value that is being output through this expression that we'll talk about a little bit later is also being updated. So in this lecture, we spoke about how we could bind the data and share the data between our controller, our view model, and our view, which is represented in index.html.